Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. We don't have many here today. Would you round those guys up and ask them to come in? They need to be in by 9:15. Okay? Thanks. They're probably out front smoking? Okay. Well, we have some families away today on a camping trip. The church organized a camping trip today, and so some of them are away in up in Stokes, up by the Water Gap in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and they're up there camping Friday night and Saturday night. And then we have a busy day today. We have baptism at 4 today, 4 o'clock this afternoon. Jim, who plays in the band, the guitar, Jim Keating will be getting baptized down at Avon on the Washington Avenue beach. And so, yeah. Well, we gauge it by Laura when she was baptized, and it was 51 degrees. So she did it in November, and it was 51. And so if it's above 51, we'll do it, you know, kind of a thing. That was chilly. Yeah, it was cold. But it's upper 68, 69, might even be 70 still. So that's not too bad. Yeah, I'm not going to stay in and swim, but how are you all today? Good to see you. Good to see you. Let's open in prayer. Father, I thank you for this time together to study your word, and I pray that you'll bless us as we prepare ourselves to see how much you teach us in your word about loving you and others, that we would be prepared, God, to grow in each step of that love with every element that we face. Help us to do this, I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So let's look together. We started last week, we finished up with loving God, where we start with, which is the first command is to love the Lord your God, and we saw what that is. And then today, or last week, we started with love one another. I just kind of briefly jumped into it. Reggie, how are you this morning? Good to see you. That's okay. Have a seat. I forgot, what's your name again? Teddy. Good to see you again, Teddy. Thanks for coming today. If you need a Bible, the Bible in the pew in front of you, you may take and keep, put your name in it. All right? If you'd like to have it. John 13, well, and we'll touch that one real quick. John 13 is very significant because Jesus tells his disciples at this point that he gives them a new command. And yet what we see doesn't appear to be new. In John 13, 34 and 35, hi Pan. A new command I give you, love one another. Now that was not new. The command to love one another was in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant. In Leviticus, the Israelites were told to love one another. And but he says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. That's the newness of the command, is that they were to follow it and understand it by the way Jesus interpreted it and with his own life. And of course, I briefly said to you last week that we have an acronym WINS, W-I-N-S, that helps you to remember, how did Jesus love me? How am I to love others the way Jesus loved me? Does anybody remember what the W stands for? Willful. It's a willful love. It wasn't that he had to. It wasn't that he was required to. He desired to. It was the desire of his will to love us even while we were yet sinners. So it was a willful love. Anybody remember what the I and in WINS, the acronym WINS, stands for? Boy, you're good, Sandy. You got this down. Initiative, that's right. Stands for taking the initiative. Don't wait for others to love you first. You love them first. You take the step when it comes to loving one another. You do it first. You take the initiative. If you're waiting for someone else to move first, you might wait a long, long, long time. So the best way to approach this is for you to take the initiative to make the first step. So, and then the S in the acronym WINS, W-I-N-S. What does the S stand for, Sandy? Sacrifice. Very good. I knew you would know. That's why I asked you. Sacrifice, sacrificial. You make the sacrifice because loving others and loving them first often takes a sacrifice. You may not feel like doing it. They may not have treated you kindly. They may have done wrong to you. They may not be considerate of you. They may not be, they may only be selfish and self-centered in their situation. But if you make the sacrifice, an example again is Jesus, who willfully loved us, took the initiative in loving us, and then made the ultimate sacrifice, which was he gave his life for us, so that we could be loved the same way he loves us. So try to remember that acronym WINS, and try to remember what the W-I-N-S stand for. It will go a long way in your relationships, whether it's at work, at home, whether it's with your colleagues or with your friends or your classmates, wherever it is, it will go a long way in helping you to understand how we are called as Christians to love one another. And then here's another wonderful thing he says in verse 35 as a result of this. When you love one another this way, when you love others the way I've loved you, then by this, by loving one another the way I love you, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. So Jesus gives us his prime way of evangelizing. His prime way of identifying yourself as a believer, as a Christian. And no, it's not a bumper sticker. Or it's not wearing a cross around your neck or carrying tracts in your pocket. The primary way to show people that you're a believer, that you follow Jesus, that you're a Christian is when you love others the way Jesus has loved you. And he says, by this, all men will know that you're my disciples. That's pretty significant. That's pretty powerful. So God, by saying that, is saying that the world will be watching. So when we, for example, last week in church on Sunday, I had no idea that Gilbert was going through such a week that he went through and was having problems. His medicine he was on for 4 months, I learned, he became allergic to. And it's the medicine that dries up his saliva so that he doesn't have to, because he can't swallow with his ALS. He's lost his muscle control. He can't swallow. So if he builds up too much saliva, he could choke, even choke to death. So when he became allergic to this medication, that meant that they had to put, like, you remember Mr. Thirsty in the dentist office, where they put that suction thing in your mouth and it sucks up the saliva as the doctors work on you? You have to do that. At that time, it was every 3 to 5 minutes, all day, all night. I mean, to go without sleep is a form of torture. It's terrible to go without sleep. And he and Marie and Philippe, they call him Philippe, Andrew, have been doing this and trying to, so it just crushed my heart on Sunday when I heard that he's having this problem. We just had to, as a church family, come around them and pray and try to encourage them and see her and talk to her. So we had some visitors and it wasn't what they were expecting in a church service, right? But that's okay. They got to see our love for one another. And when they get to see that, then they realize that people here are important then. I had one person who was a visitor say they were quite impressed with that because they never went to a church where people cared that much for one another. So that's good to see and to show. So Jesus says this is very, very important. Okay, let's go on to a couple new passages with this. Go to Ephesians chapter 4. Yes, Marie, I call her Marie. between Anne Marie and Marie Paz, I get the Maries together. She told me yesterday when she was here for practice that it might be 10 minutes to 15 minutes now in between having to use it, but it's still all day and all night, so still a problem. And he can't sleep very well laying down. Yeah, I mean, because of his neck. His neck can't support his head. The muscles in his neck are so weak. Yeah, it's a horrible, debilitating disease, ALS. You ever heard of Lou Gehrig's disease? That's what it is, ALS. Okay, Ephesians 4, 1 through 2. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Here the command of the one another command to love has a description to it. What's the description about loving one another? What does it say to do? Bearing with one another. What does bearing mean? I'm glad you asked. It would be the word that the Greek language would use about a wrestling match. That's pretty visible, illustrative, isn't it? Two people are wrestling, and that's the idea of bearing with one another, is that you're going to stay together, you're going to hold on, and you're going to work this out. You're not going to just walk away. You're going to bear with one another. You're going to hang in there together. Questions or comments on that?
Is that the same as putting up with?
It's stronger than putting up.
Okay.
Yeah, it's stronger than putting up with one another. Because sometimes you can put up from a distance. But the bearing gives the implication that you're in this to fix it. You're in this to solve it. You're not going to just ignore it. You're going to be in there to solve it. It's the idea of contact, of two people wrestling, and wrestling together with something.
No matter what.
No matter what. Get in there and wrestle with it. Yep, bearing with one another in love. That's a pretty good description there. Okay, questions on that one? I'm just reviewing some of these things about the love commands. All right. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 4:9. I'll put these in order of going left to right in your Bible. First Thessalonians 4:9. Paul says every letter he writes to a church, he talks about loving, in every single one. Loving the body, loving one another, loving others, loving whatever it is. He talks about loving. In fact, he usually mentions in his salutation, I heard about your love for others, for the saints. I heard about this. And also he usually he uses this threefold combination that well, I ask you, what three things does he mention besides love? What's the other two? Grace,
Hope,
and faith. Yeah. Your faith, not grace, your faith, your hope, and your love. That I've heard of these things, and he says to encourage you in these things, faith, hope, and love. And in Corinthians he says faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. So that's the trilogy he often uses in his letters. Now, 1 Thessalonians 4:9. Now about your love for one another, we do not need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. So let's break this down a little bit here. He's about your love for one another. I don't need to write to you about it. And why does he say he doesn't need to write to you as Christians about the importance of loving one another? What does he say is the reason? The rest of the verse. They've already been taught by whom? By God. It's God who teaches you and reminds you that you are to love one another. In other words, this is something the Spirit of God will pinch you on. We'll give you a little nudge once in a while, a little stab once in a while. that he's the one that reminds us that as you hear things and your heart is moved in compassion to those, it's the Spirit of God that does that, because it's part of being a believer, is loving one another is something that God has us do and wants us to do, because this is how we show we love him, when we love one another. So it's a very important aspect of the Christian life. That's why in our purpose statement we purpose to please God in our love and service for Jesus and others. So it's an important aspect of the Christian life. It's what we concentrate on, what you need to concentrate on. There's many things you have the freedom to do as a church in the New Testament, but there's some things that we're required to do. And those things we must be doing first. If we don't get to other things, we didn't get to them. But those things we can't ignore, we can't neglect. They're the things that must be done. And loving others, loving one another is one of those things. Now the one another, who is he talking about when he says love one another, when he's talking to letters to Christians and to a church? Who does he mean when he says, basically who's he talking about when he says love one another?
Believers.
Fellow believers. Fellow believers. And we're going to see next where John often uses the term, instead of one another, he talks about love your brother, meaning brother and sister. But he's usually talking about loving other believers. Now, we're going to see that no one gets excluded from the command to love them. I mean, we got love God, love one another, love your brothers and sisters, love your neighbor, and then the last one we look at is love your enemy, which is the one that reason I started this study, because I want to get to that one, and I want to have all this foundation to build upon, to go back to as we are told to do that, and what's it going to look like? How does that exhibit itself? So, as individuals, okay? Let's look at our last one that we have on this list for today, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. Keep turning to the right. Hebrews, James, and then 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8. In this paragraph entitled Living for God by the people who put the NIV Bible together, the editors, they entitled this Living for God because there's so many statements being made here, one command after another, about things to do as a believer in living for God. And in verse 8 he says, above all, love each other deeply. Some Bibles translate it sincerely. Some say deeply. It's both of those things. It means with sincere depth of love. Love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. When you're actively loving each other, you're not paying attention and getting upset by each other's faults. See, one of the things we got to recognize is that in any body of believers, in any church body, it's made up of sinners saved by grace, right? Yes. Okay. So as we work together and we do things together, we will at times offend one another because we're sinners saved by grace. And we will be selfish, we will be angry at times. There's all kinds of things that will happen because we are sinners saved by grace. But what he wants us to understand is that instead of allowing every offense, every little thing that happens become a war to you, a battle to you, an offense to you, he says when you love one another, you cover over a multitude of sins. You just let it go. You realize they might be having a bad day, or maybe there's something else in their mind. You don't take the offense and harbor it and swallow it. Then it becomes a problem. Eventually, what we're going to look at in our morning message, it can become a root of bitterness. But instead, by letting it go and in love covers over a multitude of sins. You can determine just to love one another and not let that bother you. So you came to church this morning, and Pastor was going down the aisle saying hi to everybody, and he got to you and he skipped you and just kept going. And you say, well, what is wrong with that guy? You know, what's wrong with me? Don't I count or something? Well, it may be that he just thought of something, because he's one-track minded. He just thought of something that he had to take care of, and he needed to do it before he forgets, because when on Sundays he has one thing on his mind normally, and that's the class and the message, and so he may not notice that. And so when love overlooks it and says, there might be other reasons, you know, it's no big deal. And next week, I'll be sure to say hi to him first or something. And I use that as a real example because people have gotten upset with me because I didn't say hi to them. And you know what? I never even saw them because of my one-track mindedness at times. Doris?
Could this also be the other side of the coin, which is you're saving yourself from a multitude of sins? If you're really truly loving someone, then you're not going to be judging, you're not going to build up bitterness, you're not going to...
Exactly. There's two sides to this coin.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it always benefits us. You're never at a disadvantage when you love others. You're never at a disadvantage. It always benefits you. That's a good point.
Plus, the one that won't love is carrying the heavier weight
Yes.
themselves.
That's right.
If they got rid of that weight, they would be
Yep.
able to love the other.
Yeah, it's a good point, Jeanette. The one that loves, who doesn't love, is carrying a heavier weight. So, and self-centeredness is a terrible sin because you'll never be satisfied because you think everybody in the world thinks about you, what you're thinking about, as much as you do. Guess what? They're not. They got their own things to think about. And people get offended easily and upset easily because you know, I was wearing new shoelaces and you didn't say anything about it. Sorry, I didn't even notice you had shoes on, you know, kind of a thing. So it's remarkable what we as human beings will do, but you're right. Love covers over a multitude of sins. When you show love, you stop yourself from being judgmental and petty and angry and vengeful and bitter. Most of all, bitter. So, okay, very good. Y'all got that down pretty well. Now, let me change my PowerPoint. Oh, please put my Bible today. Can you take? Oh, here it is, right here. Let me just escape out of this and go back to here. There's probably a quicker way to do this, but this is how I do it. This is the slow person's way of getting it
I'm
done.
right there with you.
You right there with me?
Oh, yeah.
And now I'm going to go to slideshow. I'm going to go from beginning, and hopefully we didn't do anything. Oh, there it is. Okay, we got it right. It worked. Is there a quicker way to do that, Nick? Probably, right?
Yeah, we'll go through that tomorrow.
Okay, we'll go through it. Don't make it today, though, okay? Thank you very much. And make it when I'm awake. All right. So the next aspect of our study is actually the same. It's a continuation of loving one another, but John, the Apostle John, in his writings, he prefers, and the other apostles will use it too. It's not exclusive to him, but he prefers to use the word brother. Love your brother. And when he says brother, it's the word anthropoi, which means mankind, people. So, and then there's the word adelphos, which is like Philadelphia is brotherly love. Well, when brother is used in that sense, it's used to talk about a representative of both men and women. For in the Greek culture, masculine nouns of, excuse me, when the context was, did I just unclick myself? No, we're good. Masculine nouns covered both genders. So if the context, like I have a brother, I just have a brother, a male brother. I don't have any sisters. You all are my brothers. Well, there's males and females here. And so in Greek, that's how it would handle that. It would call male and females together by the same term, brothers. In our culture, we have, in the last 20 years or so, we have developed more and more where in our culture, a male representative doesn't include females, that they can use a female noun as well to include both male and female. So the NIV many times now says if it's using brother, but it's referring to brothers and sisters, it will say brothers and sisters, so that the culture can understand what's meant and not think it's only talking about males, it's talking about both males and females, okay? It's not a problem with the scriptures, it's a problem with the culture. And if you're going to reach the culture, you gotta translate in a way that reaches the culture and speaks their language. So now, John uses the phrase brother and sister. So let's go through parts of the book of 1 John. 1 John chapter 2. So just a few pages from Peter to the right, we're continuing to the right there. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, John instructs the believers to love their fellow believers and do not hate. So verse 9 are you with me? 1 John chapter 2, verse 9. Anyone who claims, that is to make a profession, to say this is you, who claims to be in the light, that's, if you look up to chapter 1, you'll see that the fellowship with God was walking in the light as God is in the light. So it means having a life with God, being a Christian. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. So if I say I'm a believer and I've been born again and I have the Spirit of God in me, well, if I really have been born again, if I have the Spirit of God within me, then certain things are going to happen and are going to be true about me because the Spirit of God won't let it not be. And so he says, if you are a brother, if you're a professing believer and you hate another brother or sister, you are still in the darkness. If you hate another believer, you're still in the darkness. Because God says we cannot hate and be of the Lord. It doesn't go together. Now, you may have a problem with somebody, and you may need to get that corrected. But if you don't get that corrected, and you continue in that problem, and you make it even worse and worse and worse, and you get to where you really hate that person and anger, then God says you got a problem. You got a problem with your own relationship to me, because I won't let you do that. I won't let you do it. Pretty strong stuff, isn't it? Any questions on it or comments about it? How it works? I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. So whoever claims to be in light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there's nothing in them to make them stumble. So as love covers over a multitude of sins, love also enables us to walk in righteousness and godliness. Verse 11, but anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they're going because the darkness has blinded them. Pretty strong stuff about where we need to be in our relationship to God and to others. Pretty strong. Comments on that? All right, let's look down to chapter 3 of 1 John. So he doesn't let go of this. He's going to mention it in chapters 2, 3, and 4. Chapter 3, verses 11 through 18. For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. So that has been around. 1 John was a book written later in the order of how the books were written, the letters and epistles written. So he's one of the later ones. And it's already been well known amongst the churches about the importance of loving one another and these one another commands. You should love one another. And then he uses an illustration. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. You remember the story of Cain and Abel in the Genesis? Okay. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. So you shouldn't be surprised at that. When the world hates Christians, don't get upset. They're just rabbits eating carrots. It's their nature to do that. You don't have to sit there. You know, there's things you can do to show love and response and stuff, but you should expect that to happen. If the world hates you, it's because, do not surprise, in verse 13, if it hates you, verse 14, we know that we have passed from death to life because we love each other. That's one of the signs of you becoming a new person in Christ. Anyone who does not love remains in death. So you can't say you're a believer and yet you hate and you do not love. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. Well, you're not going to go to prison for hating a brother or sister because the laws of our land don't say if you hate someone, you're guilty of killing them. But in God's eyes, which is most important, in God's eyes, hating somebody is as if you murdered them. In fact, the root of murder is hatred. That's what the root of it is many times, is hatred. That's why in Matthew he says the same thing, that you have murdered when you do it, when you're angry in your heart. In God's eyes, that's how serious it is. So our anger needs to be understood, that to God, our anger is a very serious thing. He considers it murder. I hear silence.
It can be so bad that it can destroy a person. The anger.
Anger can be so bad it destroys another person, destroys your relationship to that person as if they are dead. There are people who get so angry, I never want to see you or talk to you again. It's like as if you were dead. You know? Cut off all communication. It's a shame when it happens within families, isn't it? And people, you know, just, I don't want to see you or talk to you. To me, you're dead. That's anger. You know? Let's keep going here. Verse 15. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. That's not those who've been forgiven. That's talking about active murdering. Verse 16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. So now he's going to show us the difference between hating and loving. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Well, that's the ultimate goal, is that you'd be willing to surrender your life to protect and help a brother or sister in their situation. That you'd be willing to lay down your life for them. That's why it's often been said that when people die in war, they've given the ultimate sacrifice of love, because they were willing to surrender their life that you could live free, that you could, so it was their life for your lives, or for the lives of others. And it comes from this understanding, which is true. But the reality is, not many of us are going to be called upon by God to actually have to surrender our life for another person, to have to die for a person. Some may, and it may happen. But let's start here, is what John is going to say. Look at what he says here. He says, verse 17, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, well then how can the love of God be in that person? So what does he say about your profession to love if you see a brother or sister who has a need and you have the ability to meet it. What's he saying about that?
See the action.
He says, how can you say you love them if you do nothing about it? Billy, I'm waiting for somebody to ask a question or make a comment in class today.
Pity.
P.
How do we get to helping from pity? The definition of pity to me is not necessarily doing something.
Okay, you get to helping from pity because pity means to have compassion. And before you can help, your heart needs to be moved with compassion. And compassion moves your pocketbook. Compassion moves the feet. Compassion does something about it.
So compassion would be a good,
Compassion's a great thing.
no, I'm saying to replace the word pity?
Yes.
Compassion,
Same word for mercy. It's the same word for mercy. It's translated different by the context, but it's the same word for mercy. And compassion is a great English word made up of a compound. It's a compound word. And the first preface, the come part, is from Greek, which means to be with. To be with. And the second thing is also Latin and Greek, passion. To be with passion. Well, passion is to be moved in your heart, to care, to have passion for something. And so compassion is to be with feelings, to be with feelings for the other person. What are some English idioms we use for that? To walk in their shoes,
Oh, I
you know, something like that. To where you put yourself in their place.
You can say, I know.
Yeah, well, if you really do.
If you do.
You're right. People say I know too quickly without really knowing many times. But if you could put yourself in their place, then it will cause you to have pity and compassion. So that's where it starts. And I'm glad you asked about the P word. That's where it starts. It starts with compassion. Let's use my Wegmans example I used last year. If you're standing in line in Wegmans and you're paying for your groceries, and this time of the year from now until after Thanksgiving, they ask if you want to donate to the food bank to help. You want to raise up your change to an even, round it off to help. And if you take $5 out and you throw it out and go, here, you know, well, did you really help? Yes, your money is going to be used to buy some more food. But what about God? In God's eyes, did you really help?
The attitude was bad.
Yeah, because the attitude wasn't one of compassion, wasn't one of pity. It was one of, take this and let me get out of here, kind of a thing. Whereas if you did it happily and thankfully in your heart, then it's done with compassion.
I'm in an AP composition class, and we are learning about...
Did you lose your voice?
No, just...
Having a hard time, okay.
a little bit. I did last week, but I'm in a class where I'm learning about arguments, and part of that is learning how people use like emotions to appeal to others. And something that my teacher says is she does not like it when, like, she does not donate her money on a whim. She does not like give up her money on just like a spur of the moment kind of account. She always, her and her husband will spend a few hours every year, and they will go through all of like,
All the charities and different things.
basically, and then they'll figure out which place they want to send their donation to that year. And that's something that I've been thinking about more and more with that, is because I've always like donated to those different kinds of things at ShopRite and at like outside of Walmart or whatever, the Salvation Army, and it's like I'm trying to balance between being smart about this and still being a Christian about this.
Well, did y'all hear what she was asking? Could you hear her voice, Lana? That was good. I'm not going to ask if they're Christians. I don't want you to make that judgment about them. I'll ask, what would God say to do? Well, he does say to use wisdom in all things. In all things. You don't just throw your money at something. But if God moves your heart with compassion, then what would he want you to do? To give. So the best thing I think to do is, yeah, there's all these various things we can choose from. I mean, in America, we have things bombarding us all the time. We only have so many resources. But whatever God moves you to do, that's what I think he wants you to do. Because it's having the compassion first. It's not just giving the money. It's having the compassion.
The other part of that, which is if you have the means to do it and you don't, how does that factor into what was
Well, as
said?
a Christian, that's wrong. For the world, they have their own standard. But God always, when we talk about giving as believers, he always, the rule is to be generous. There is no percentage. It's be generous. And the bottom of the rule is don't give so much that now you become somebody that they got to, you become somebody they got to take care of themselves. That, you know, that you become that person that the church has to support because you give all your money away.
What exactly did that verse say? It's like if you have the ability to do it and you don't. What was the rest of that? One of the verses that was up there.
If you see, here's what it says.
Yeah.
The Samaritan, maybe.
No, it's right here.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. If anyone has material possessions, this is verse 17, and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person?
Right there.
Now, verse 17 doesn't say the whole thing. Verse 18 says, "Dear children, let us love not with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." So there needs to be a demonstration of it. Now, you can take pity, and if you don't have any resources at that time, you can't do anything about it. So the pity can cause you to do what at that time? Pray for the person, treat them nicely, encourage the person, whatever it is, do other things, but you may not be able to give them what they need at that time.
What you
Jeanette?
talked about last week, though, about Wilbur, I think that was really good.
Couldn't quite hear the second thing you said. Last week about what?
About Gilbert, last week, what you talked about. If we could give a little.
Oh, right, helping out, if you can give us some time to go help, yes,
So,
yeah. Some things happened already this week. They were paying money to have their lawn done,
oh,
and
see.
somebody else from church is going to do their lawn for them, so that they don't have to pay money to get that done. There have been a couple of people who volunteered to be there to help them when Marie Paz works, so that Andrew doesn't have to stay up late at night till midnight to do this. He can go to bed. Somebody else will be there to do it, and then there are some others that are skilled who have volunteered to come during the day after Marie Paz works, and she's worked a 12-hour shift, 13 hours actually by the time she fills out her paperwork and gets home. She needs to go to sleep. Well, she hasn't been able to because then Andrew's at school. She's got to take care of. I mean, I don't know how these guys have functioned.
You also talked about a little bit helping them out in finances, because it's hard for them right now.
Sure, with the finances, right. The Deacons Fund. We asked you to consider, okay, now I understand what you were saying.
Yeah.
We asked you to consider on Deacons Fund Sunday to give a little extra if you can. Don't take it away from your regular giving, but if you can give extra to the Deacons Fund, we appreciate it, because we're going to be using, we mentioned, we're going to be using that. Normally we don't tell you when it's being used, but we're going to be using it to help them, because half of the expense for taking care of the nurse that comes in at nighttime, the days that she works, half of that is being paid by the ALS Foundation. They gave her a scholarship. But the other half, they're left to pay. And so we want to help them to carry that burden, kind of a thing. Yeah. So when you hear that and you say, well, let me give more, a little extra more to the Deacons Fund, it all helps to make that come to pass. That's loving in deeds and action. And there may be others that hear it and say, I would love to, but I just can't right now. That's fine too. It's the fact that you had pity first. You were moved with compassion first. That's the first thing God wants to see from us. And then genuine, if it's genuine compassion, we're going to follow up on it somehow, in some way, as possible. That would be my description of it. We help them with that passion word better, Bill?
Yeah, now I got another word.
Okay, what's the next one?
Need.
Need.
That's
That's a subjective word, isn't it?
Yeah, that's always a struggle for me, as to when you see someone, you can have compassion on them, but not really recognize what they're telling you is a need, but as a symptom of something else, not really the problem.
And that is a complicated subject.
It is, and it doesn't.
No, I mean it.
Sounds easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. If I use the standard of Malawi, there are no needs in America.
Yeah.
Nobody has a need. You're alive. You're not starving to death. You're not eating corn cobs. And it's relative. It is relative. We talk about needs in the church. And yet, when you compare us to other demographics, we don't have any needs. And so, what does it come down to? Do you have to have a standard? You know, I'll give you my bottom line. It's whatever God moves my heart as a need. The person, and I have said this many times, I'm willing to be conned to show them the love of God. I know I'm being conned, but I'm willing to be conned to show them the love of God. And that doesn't happen all the time, but it's happened sometimes. I don't give to every panhandler. My brother here told me, do you mind if I tell you? My brother here told me he was in Trenton for how many years?
It was just 6 months.
6 months he lived in Trenton panhandling. And that's how he lived, on the streets. Now, obviously, some people gave you money, right?
Absolutely.
And others didn't.
Correct.
Okay. And if I had been there and seen him, I would depend upon God to show me, do I want to help him or do I not want to help him? And then generally, if he's panhandling at Trenton on Cass Street across from the prison, if God wants me to help him, I'm going to take him across to McDonald's and say, here, let me buy you lunch. As a means of help, which I'm sure people did too, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So need is such a relative term that as a believer, this is where sensitivity to the Spirit of God comes in. I got to listen to what he wants me to do in this situation because it may be a genuine need compared to others, it may not be a big thing. I may be enabling them to continue in messing their lives up. So, it's not a good thing. If I see a man panhandling who has a brown bag and he's drinking from it, I'm not going to give him money because I don't want to enable him to just buy some more. And I'm sure you've been aware of that that's people don't want to help somebody continue to if they're drinking to keep drinking. They want to help them to get sober. Other questions, comments? We'll finish this up next week. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned that to me. Was it Pat?
Me? Teddy.
No,
Teddy. Why I can't get Teddy, man?